In topic 9.4, we're talking about anthropogenic increases in greenhouse gases. So we know that humans have been adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at an accelerating rate since the Industrial Revolution. So we could see a graph here of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations going back hundreds of thousands of years. And what we see is generally a cycling of carbon dioxide levels up and down. During the times when carbon dioxide levels are high were warmer periods on Earth. During the times when carbon dioxide levels were lower, those are times of colder periods or ice ages. But what we can see when we get to more recent times, we can see just the rapid acceleration in carbon dioxide concentration in the last recent history. We know that adding these greenhouse gases to the atmosphere results in a warming Earth, rising sea level because of melting ice sheets and the thermal expansion of the oceans. It can result in the spreading of disease towards the poles. It can result in changing population dynamics and climate refugees, especially in coastal areas. So there are all these impacts of climate change, and we'll talk in great detail about those in coming topics. And so we can look at this increase in greenhouse gases, and we can predict into the future what is likely to happen. And this graph shows the annual greenhouse gas emissions. These are in carbon dioxide equivalents, so they include all greenhouse gases. We can see the historic data is shown here in gray. And then we have the future. And we can predict out into the future the amount of carbon dioxide that will be emitted based on different scenarios. We often, in climate modeling, will look at different scenarios. And so the no climate policy, this is expected if countries just continue on the pathway that they are using fossil fuels and releasing CO2. We can see that's this pink line, and it would result in a change in climate of 4 to 4.8 degrees Celsius. And there's some uncertainty here. You can see a wide range of potential outcomes. So there is a fair amount of uncertainty here, but it still results in a very significant increase in climate. A change in global temperature by 4 degrees is catastrophic. Based on current policies that are in place by countries in terms of reducing emissions, we have this orangish section, okay, which would result in a warming of somewhere around 3 degrees Celsius. If countries can meet their pledges and targets that they've made through things like the Paris Accords, then we might take this yellow pathway, reducing that warming to 2.5 to 2.8 degrees Celsius. And there are also pathways that can help, that can lead to us keeping warming 2 degrees, around 2 degrees, or around 1.5 degrees Celsius. But these are quite unlikely, though, especially the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. When we look at the sources of these greenhouse gases, we can look at the various countries that are emitting these. So if we look at the total emissions, we can see that's how this list is ranked. China first, then the United States, India, Russia, Japan, and so forth. But totals can be misleading because we have different population sizes clearly in these countries. When you look at a per capita, per person carbon emissions, then things change. A place like Saudi Arabia has per capita carbon emissions of 19. The US 15, Russia 12, Korea 12, and some of these countries such as India, which is third total, per capita is very much lower, around 2 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per person. And so we have to take that into account as we start to think about how to address these emissions. We could also think about the historic emissions of greenhouse gases. Okay? This is about who has contributed historically to carbon dioxide emissions. And what we can see is the USA is here. It's about 25% of global cumulative emissions. Next highest is the EU with 22%. Then we have China with 12%, Russia 6%, and you can see the various other countries here. And so when we look at this historic data, for example, much of the developing world, such as the US and the EU, built their economies, built their standards of living on the use of fossil fuels. And those countries that were first into the Industrial Revolution used huge amounts of coal and other fossil fuels, contributing to these carbon dioxide emissions. And so those countries that have contributed the most are also some of the most economically developed. And something that you'll hear when you're talking to people about climate change and how we mitigate the impacts of climate change and how we reduce the amount of potential climate change. One thing that people often say are those that have contributed the most are suffering the least, or those that have contributed the least to climate change will suffer the most from its impacts. And that's something to keep in mind. And climate activists will often talk about a just transition, about making sure that these countries, less developed economically countries, do not bear the brunt of the effects of climate change.